So I want to talk to you a little bit about what's happening in Syria. And to understand what's happening, we need to talk about the Alawites, who they are, where they come from, and how they went from being this marginalized mountain people to ruling Syria for the last 4 decades. The Alawites were never part of Syria's urban elite. They weren't the ruling class in Damascus or Aleppo. They didn't control trade routes or govern empires. They were known as an unruly mountain people, isolated, self-sufficient, and far from power. For centuries, they lived in the coastal mountain range of northwestern Syria, in and around Latakia and Tartus. This wasn't rich, fertile land. It was rugged, difficult terrain that made large-scale agriculture impossible. Most Alawites were peasants, farmers, and herders, cut off from the cities, governing themselves in small, close-knit communities. And this isolation shaped their entire history. While the Sunni majority ruled the cities, like Damascus, controlling trade, education, and the military, the Alawites historically were outcasts, far from the centers of power. During the Ottoman times, this divide only got worse. The Ottomans saw Syria's Sunni urban elite as their natural allies, appointing them as governors and administrators. Meanwhile, the Alawites were pushed further and further into the mountains, taxed into poverty, and forced to rely on their own communities for survival. And for centuries, they had no power, no influence, and no future in the politics of Syria. But then something happened that changed everything. Fast forward to World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapses, and the European colonial powers divide up the Middle East like a chessboard. In 1916, Britain and France signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, carving up the region. Britain takes Palestine and Iraq, France takes Lebanon and Syria. And when the French arrive in Syria, they have a problem. The Sunni majority doesn't want them there. Almost immediately, revolts break out. And the French need an ally, a group who has no loyalty to the Sunni elites, one that they can rely on. And that's where the Alawites come in. The region the Alawites were from, Latakia, is a coastal region, and it became really important to French rule because the French ruled Syria by controlling the coastline. And so the Alawites became a natural ally to the French. And in the 1930s and 40s, France started to recruit Alawites into their military and police forces. And these officers, many of them from humble, rural backgrounds, would go on to form the backbone of the Syrian military that took shape in the 1960s. But then eventually the French pulled out of Syria, and Syria gained its independence in 1946, and that's when things really started spiraling. The new government couldn't hold it together. It was coup after coup, instability at every turn. And by the late 1950s, things had gotten so bad that Syria turned to Egypt and said, let's unite, let's form a union, forming the United Arab Republic in 1958, which was one of the first true experiments in pan-Arab nationalism, which was led by none other than the president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser. But here's the thing, from day one, Egypt dominated the union, and the Syrians felt they were just along for the ride, constantly getting the short end of the stick. And it didn't take long for this resentment to boil over, and by 1961 the whole thing collapsed, throwing Syria right back to its usual chaos, coup after coup and counter coup, with a new ruler every few years. That is until 1970, when an Alawite fighter pilot by the name of Hafez al-Assad made his move. Now Hafez al-Assad, he wasn't just another military officer looking for power. He was sharp, he was calculating. He had seen how leaders before him had been toppled, and he knew that if he wanted to hold on, he had to play the game differently. So eventually, when he pulled off this smooth, bloodless coup and declared himself president, the first thing he did was build a new intelligence network called the Mukhabarat, which were kind of like the secret service of Syria. And they had eyes everywhere and were listening to everyone. And Hafez al-Assad wasn't just paranoid for the sake of it, he had good reason. He was ruling as an Alawite, a tiny minority, only about 12% of Syria's population, in a country where power had traditionally been held by the Sunni majority. And he knew that if he ever lost control, the Alawites would likely never get another chance to rule Syria. So he played his cards very carefully. He filled the military and intelligence agencies with his own people, Alawites. After all, if you control the military and if you have all the weapons, you pretty much control the country. But he also wanted to be fair and appointed many Sunnis to key government positions to keep them happy. And it was through this balancing act that he performed so well that he managed to stay in power for decades. Then in 1982, the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, who were feeling increasingly sidelined under Hafez al-Assad's rule, decided to rise up in the city of Hama. They saw an opening, a chance to challenge this regime. But Hafez al-Assad was not the kind of man to negotiate with rebels. His response was swift and brutal. He sent in the army, encircled the city, he bombarded it with artillery and airstrikes, and Hama was leveled to the ground. Thousands, maybe even tens of thousands were killed, and the message was clear: rebellion would not be tolerated. And after that, no one dared to rise up against him or his family again, and the Assads would rule Syria for the next 50 years until finally in 2024, his regime fell. And now with the Alawite regime and the Assad family gone, the Alawite civilians who had nothing to do with the Assad regime are being hunted down and killed. Alawite villages in Latakia are disappearing. Families are being executed in mass killings, and the same Islamist groups that were backed by the West and armed by countries like Turkey are now wiping out an entire people in the northwest of Syria. The massacres in Latakia are not just random acts of violence, they're actually part of a history that never really went away. That's why even during the uprising in 2024, you saw many of these HTS fighters burning the grave of Hafez al-Assad. There's so much bad blood between these groups.
We came here to the graves of Hafez al-Assad, Basel and Anissa to take a look at these filthy people because they oppressed the entire Syrian people.
The groups that were once called freedom fighters a few months ago have turned into something else entirely. So after everything, the coups, the wars, the uprisings, what really changed? Because it looks like Syria just traded one brutal dictator for another, which is way, way worse. If you enjoyed that video, please consider subscribing for more, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.